Welcome to the discussion on religion and the pandemic, sponsored by the International Association of Religion Journalists. We are launching several such discussions for religion journalists in different regions of the world. You might have been watching the discussion from Asia or North America. They are there in the internet, and today we are hosting a panel discussion from Europe. And later on, you will be able to see panel discussions also from Latin America and Africa. My name is Astrid Dalehaug Norheim. I live in Bergen, Norway, and you can see some of our mountains behind us here. And I am a news editor of the newspaper Dagen, and I'm also working at the Center for Investigative Journalism at the University of Bergen. And around Europe, we have journalists joining us. Maria Paz Lopez, she is with us from Berlin. She's the foreign correspondent and a religion columnist of the Spanish daily La Vanguardia. And from 2003 to 2009, she was its correspondent in the Vatican. And she was the IARJ's first chair and is currently in the board of directors. Tom Hannigan is joining us from Paris, an American journalist based in Paris now and writes for The Tablet in London and Religion News Service in Washington. He spent 40 years as a correspondent and editor for Reuters, the last 14 of them as the religion editor, coordinating the news agency's coverage of faith around the world. In addition, he also wrote about religion in Europe and Middle East. And he has been writing several books. And from Montenegro, working in Montenegro right now, but living in Beograd, Serbia, Elena Jorgachevich, journalist of the Serbian weekly news magazine Vreme, covering mainly religion, but also other social topics. She holds an MA in religion studies from University of Erfurt in Germany, and she is doing her PhD at University of Regensburg, also Germany, on the topic of biographical memories of the church under communism. She is the region representative for Europe in the IARJ. Welcome, and welcome to everyone watching us. So we are going to talk about the COVID situation, working as a religion journalist. So how is, first, the COVID situation now where you are? Let's start in Paris, Tom. How is it?
In Paris, I just took off my mask. We had a very, very strict lockdown in the beginning, back in March to May. Then it opened up, and now they're just going back to school, and the government has been tightening up again. So, for example, we have to wear our masks everywhere outside. Before it was just inside if you went into a shop or things, but now it's even out on the street. So they're getting more and more cases. The hospital situation is okay, so it's not a worry anymore like it was in March, but it's starting to get a little bit worse.
And Maria Paz, how is it in Berlin?
So in Berlin, now in Germany, we have obligation to wear masks in public transportation and inside all shops, but not on the open air. And schools have started in most länder with no obligation of mask inside the classroom. We have some more cases now. It's this famous second wave, but it's a small second wave that we are going to see around Europe and around the world, and we have to, of course, prepare for that.
Okay, thank you. And Elena, how is it down in Montenegro and Beograd?
Well, it's getting better. Actually, it's quite different. In Serbia, we had a really harsh 2 months, June and July, because we had some tricky situation with we had election, and it proved that our government did not tell us the real number of people who were sick, and the situation were very relaxed. because people thought it's very relaxed. And the end, of course, later on it was an explosion because we didn't know how it's going on. So we had terrible 2 months, and now it's getting better. And we will see now what is going to be in September with schools and kindergartens and so on. So that is the question. In Montenegro, they at the start they did great. So they had some, and now it's so. But for now it is okay. And as I can see, at least here in the seaside, they're very responsible in shops, in markets. They wear masks in the taxis, everywhere. So it looks okay.
Sounds familiar. Here in Norway, we had a strict lockdown in March, and schools and everything closing down. And during summer, a little less restrictions, but now there is a second wave coming. It's more local and local lockdowns. But here in Bergen, a student city, we have had a small breakout now. So yeah. Thank you. And we are all religion writers, and we're going to discuss how religious groups has been affected, or what have they been doing through the pandemic. So what are you seeing where you live and the area you cover? Tom, can I ask you first?
Yeah, the area I cover is France and the Benelux countries for the tablet. So in France, especially, that's obviously the biggest one. One thing you have to remember in France, of course, is the very, very strong secularization. So 66% of the people will say they're Catholic, but only about 5% of them go to church. And so you have all these beautiful churches around, but that doesn't mean that they're very well frequented. When the lockdown came, of course, there was no attendance. So everybody went along with that, and the bishop said, yes, we agree with this. It was when the reopening started, then you started to get some problems, because the reopening was in May 11th, but they said churches wouldn't open up until June. Catholics immediately said, we need Pentecost. We want to have a feast day. So they put pressure on the government for that. Problem was, there was the Muslim end of Ramadan, and they had already said, we're not opening up the mosques for the end of Ramadan. And suddenly, at the last minute, the Catholics were able to open up, and the Muslims were caught short. And that caused problems. Nothing really big, but it caused some tension there. Now, almost every church is reopened, but of course they have social distancing, so they take much smaller numbers. In fact, in a lot of French churches, that's just fine, because they didn't fill them up before anyway. But like the English language Catholic church here in Paris, which is mostly foreigners going there, they're packed all the time. So you go there and suddenly only 60 people are allowed in, and you have to make reservations. That's very strange. Yeah, so that's the main overview.
Yeah. So how is it in Germany, Maria Paz?
So I have to say that both in Germany and Spain, I'd like to mention also too, generally speaking, like religious leaders and communities of all faiths have abode very well to the recommendations and the rules of the governments. In Germany, there were only 2 isolated cases. There was 2 clusters of infections that could be traced to religious services. One was a Pentecostal service, and the other was a Baptist church near Frankfurt, where they had been singing. And singing, as you know, is not allowed inside the building because, the droplets can get out of the mouth and provoke infection. But it was isolated cases. In Spain, there was a small controversy related to a funeral that took place in the Basilica of the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, but it was mostly a political thing within the regional government, because actually the cardinal and the faithful kept the distances, so there was no issue with that. I'd like to mention an interesting joint document that was published precisely last week a joint initiative by the Pontifical Council of Interreligious Dialogue in Rome and the World Council of Churches, which is a fellowship of Protestant, Orthodox, and Anglican and Reformed churches. I don't know if you want me, Astrid, to go on this now, or I can go to that later, whatever you prefer.
Please,
Should I go on?
yes, please.
Okay, so this document is very interesting to me because the title is very significant. It's Serving a Wounded World in Interreligious Solidarity, a Christian call to reflection and action during COVID-19 and beyond. And this document encourages all churches and Christian organizations to engage in interreligious solidarity, not only during the pandemic, but to address other wounds of the planet, of the society. And this is interesting because most communities were already doing it, but now you get like the, so to say, legal frame that you are encouraged to do that. And this text also is written in a way that tries to be useful also for practitioners of other faiths who have already responded to COVID-19 with similar thoughts in their own traditions. So I find it interesting that also at the top leadership of the churches, of the communities, they press for action. They feel that this is a historical moment in which interreligious and ecumenical effort can be enhanced because of the pandemic.
We'll come back to what they're really doing, but let's hear from Elena first. How has the religious group responded to the COVID in your area, Elena?
Well, there were, as I am hearing the other speakers, there were more tension in Serbia, and also I think in Croatia. And as I noticed in these countries with communist heritage, as Poland, Russia, Serbia, there's always that association, you know, and they're always trying to say, okay, the government again does, or society, or never mind, but someone forbids us to worship, forbids us to have its services. And at first it didn't rise, but at least in Serbia, soon you could hear from the church leadership that narrative. You know, it's again the talking about that communism times, and also you could often hear that word discrimination, because from one point the church and the part, not the whole, but feel discriminated because they cannot freely worship and restriction of gatherings. But from the other point, usually, you know, government say, okay, it's forbidden, but if something happens, no one is punished. So let's just be blind on one eye a little bit. So the other said, okay, now we are discriminated, who are not religious, because we cannot gather, we will be punished, we will be prosecuted, so on and so on. Why church can something that we cannot? So, and of course, that was a question of money, because the government at that moment during the COVID gave a huge amount of money for building the temple, of the main temple in Belgrade. So now we have health system which is poor, and now so that was a really few points of huge tensions. But from the other side, what was for me, I think, good and surprising, that you could hear different voices within the church, because you don't hear so often that theological, you know, discussions in our public sphere, to be honest. But now you could hear, and it was also the rift within the church, but you could hear that pluralism of voices in the religious community, in the churches.
So what was the debate about?
The big debate actually was Eucharist. Should it happen during COVID times or not? For once, you know, if you believe in Jesus Christ, if you're a Christian, yes, of course, that you will go to the liturgy and so on and so on. For other, it was like, okay, we will wait because now it's virus, so we will wait until it is safe. And it was the main point of discussion, and it got very harsh at the end. And then it was even from, it was public discussion, and it was public, it was discussion, conflict, even within the church, between bishops, not, you know, between the bishops, within the part of society. It became, and it was for the spokesman of the SOC announced one announcement which sounded like everyone who are real Christian, they will go to the Eucharist. Who are not, they will not. So it was that line. And okay, it's more complex, but this is some basics of it.
Maria Paz and Tom, has it been similar debates going on where you are?
No, not really, because it was mostly about following the rules and just protect public health. So not that I'm not aware of, really. No, not really, not.
The only thing that we noticed here, this question of discrimination, that only came from the evangelical churches. I noticed that Maria Paz also mentioned evangelical churches. It's not like in America where they're big and have some political influence. They're very marginal here. But the biggest breakout was in an evangelical church in Mulhouse in eastern France. And when you think about it, evangelicals here very often don't even have their own church. They just rent a hall. Very often they don't even have windows. Then they have long services where they sing a lot and they're quite active. And it's no wonder that that's a kind of vector for infection like that. Some of them started to say, well, we're discriminated against, but there were very, very few because it's a small number. But then the people in other churches, like Catholic churches, say, hey, wait a minute, we're not singing. We have bigger churches. Why can't we do this? Towards the end of the, when they were easing up the lockdown, then you started to hear that. But it wasn't that big. It sounds like Yelena's situation was much more open, public, and
yeah. And here
one difficult, sorry, just one sad and interesting development of this corona crisis here in Germany, which has nothing to do with authorities or with faith communities, is, have you seen this demonstrations of far-right activists and conspiranoics and this anti-vaccination activists? So there's a lot of groups of far-right groups, and they are using. It's becoming increasingly anti-Semitic. They pose as Holocaust victims. They carry stars of David as if they were persecuted by the rules of coronavirus, like posing as victims themselves of this aggression from the state because they are obliged to carry the masks. And the central Rat of Juden in Deutschland, they complained about this, how this anti-Semitism tendencies were getting into these conspirational theories in the debate here, and some people, they just believe it. They just believe that this has some connection. So this again has nothing to do with service, with practice, with religion, but it's targeting a group of people, the Jews in these days, and it's a bad development.
I think they inspired some people here, because I just read that the Gilets jaunes, the yellow jacket protesters from last year, are going to hold a protest against masks here in Paris. I think it's next Saturday, or this coming Saturday.
Okay,
thank you. When we have heard about the North America panel dialogue, they're talking quite a lot about how religious groups are participating in helping out during the pandemic. The Sikh community of Los Angeles handing out food, doing distribution, helping people. Have you seen anything like that? Do the faith communities play any role? Maria Paz, you mentioned something about more dialogue and a call to help from the leaders. But what have you seen really happening?
Like all communities, churches, synagogues, and particularly mosques are doing this, helping out people who are getting unemployed. Because even in Germany, where they are doing quite well, of course, those who have worse jobs, they are the ones who are being more hit by the economic crisis brought by the pandemic. So, there's the usual distribution of food, of clothes, and these kind of things. Again, very, very often in mosques and in churches. And an interesting thing is that, of course, here in Germany we have like 5 million Muslims, more or less. But in fact, the number is bigger because there's also the refugees that arrived in the from the Middle East that arrived in the wave of 2015. So the numbers are not clear, but all those refugees are scattered around the country, living in either in community allotments or in houses, but they need extra attention. So really, the faith communities are addressing also this problem, which they were doing already, but with the pandemic they are doing it more. And again, in Germany, both the Protestant church, like Evangelisch, and the Catholic church, they are quite rich because of the tax system in Germany, so they can really do a lot of good work in charities helping the people in need. So I would say that most of the communities have benefited from that also.
So what are they doing really? Handing out food, or what are they doing?
Yes, mostly it's handing out food, clothes, and trying to redirect people who have lost their jobs to other kind of jobs that may be available. So like real usual things in times of crisis, that's not different from another type of economic crisis. Yes.
Do you know about how that works also in Spain and Italy? What the faith groups are doing there?
Well, I cannot be specific about what's going on in Spain because I'm looking from the outside. I'm looking more at the political level. But the charity branch of the Catholic Church, which is Caritas, it's the same name everywhere, has always been very, on the ground to working with this. So they were developing the same. But one good thing is that if you have a strong religious institutional organization, when bad things happen, it's quite easy to mobilize the volunteers because they were already there and because the institutions are ready for action. So in this sense, this worked quite well, I think. Yes.
So Elena, you're in the area that this has been most tense of us. Has the faith groups, the church, done anything for those in need
Yes,
in Serbia?
The churches and religious communities, not just in Serbia, but in the region, as I saw, they gave donation in medical equipment and also offering people food, and not just food, but buying them food, because for older people who couldn't go out, they just bought them. I have to admit that except on their web pages, or if you know someone personally, or if you see that call in the church, you couldn't, more or less, you couldn't see that in media so often. So even you could hear some kind of complaint, like whenever we do something good, no one sees that. But also when it comes when it comes to this, let's say, positive things, I would say that, for example, minority religions in all the regions, so for example, I don't know, Serbian Orthodox Church somewhere or Catholic Church in Serbia, or they acted also very responsibly from the very beginning, and they very fast, they switched their way of normal functioning to some, I don't know, to virtual services, to so on. And why is that important? Okay, they could serve as an examples in the society, but also, they don't like to change anything so much, but it was quite fast, how they just did it. And also I mentioned this, finally I mentioned these voices within the church, and some of bishops of the Serbian Orthodox Church and other religious communities representatives really sent very rational the messages, which was full, but not just empty hope, but very reflective, very important messages in the public. So that I would emphasize some positive things in this sea of negative things that happen.
It's important. So how has it been to be a religion reporter during this time? What have you seen that has surprised you, Elena?
Well, That's great American word. It was challenging, you know, because
Why?
it, it was this, for example, as I mentioned, this question Eucharist, or this question of going into the church. That was, for one, that was really like what the church is doing. You know, they cannot do it. It should be punished harshly. It should be, no. It was a lot of fears everywhere. And for the other side, the part of the church really felt that like a strong attack, you know, on their core being and so on and so on. So it was hard, you know, and it is already those fluid, crazy time, Corona times. So you should find some balance in order not to provoke even more, not to make situation even more fluid. Because what was also the problem, we didn't have so clear guidelines. For example, let's take Serbian Patriarch. At first he was, of course, we should obey the government rules. And the second was, we should, of course, but if you have need to go to the church, go. And third, the president said, okay, it's forbidden. But if you go, I will not do anything. So it was always, you know, many things involved. So in order to make it clear, it was, as I said, challenging. And, you know.
So challenging in Serbia. Tom, how has it been in France to be a religion writer?
Well, first of all, you couldn't go to any church because they closed them down, and everybody did that. So there wasn't any discussion about that. Secondly, you could only talk to people on the phone. Like, we were literally limited to a 1 kilometer radius. So, you know, you can only go within 1 kilometer, and you had to carry a document saying where you lived and everything. And so police could figure it out. You know, I got stopped one time and they asked. I was out on my bicycle. So there wasn't much you could do then. And there were a few incidents during the lockdown. One, which was so typically French, they were allowed to make YouTube broadcasts, and most of the churches had broadcasts, so they had their daily mass and Sunday mass and all. And since there's an anti-clerical tradition here, policemen heard some noise inside a church and broke into it. And there were only 7 people there, including the priest who was there, and there were technicians to broadcast it. And they wanted to come in and arrest them for breaking the rules. And they were allowed to have 12 people, I think, together. They were allowed to broadcast it. That sent the Archbishop of Paris up the wall. He was screaming about it. He exaggerated it.
And then you, as a journalist, you were not able to go in there and cover it.
No, there was no way. That was too far away.
Yeah.
So no, the thing that I find most interesting is, in fact, something that it's a long feature to write about. They don't have people going back to church, partly because they're afraid of infection, partly because they don't like the idea of having to reserve a space and we're not quite sure and things like that. Partly because a lot of people got used to either watching Mass on Sunday on the television, or they just said, why should I go? I can't go see my friends, and I can't. So the rector of Notre Dame Cathedral said the other day that about 30% of the people seem to have stopped going to church, and he doesn't know whether they're actually going to come back. So maybe, some of them are older and they're afraid of getting infected and all. If I can add something to just what's said before about what did the churches do. They did all the typical charity work, but in contrast to Germany, where the churches have a lot of money, here in France they don't, because they don't get any money from the state, no taxes like that. It's all, they get it out of the collections and contributions. So they're worrying now, what if people don't come back? Because they have suffered a big drop in income. And the rector, when he was talking, the rector from Notre Dame, he said, we have food banks and things like that, but we need money to keep that running. And if we run out of money, we can't do it anymore. You can't be charitable if you can't go and get the things you're going to be distributing.
Mm.
So it's the situation here.
Huge economic questions coming up, and will go on for a long time,
Yeah.
probably. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I can add from Norway, we see the same thing. The churches had gone online, and they are so worried, many of them, that people might not come back to church.
Yeah.
So why should they? And they don't want to register because maybe they're taking someone else's place that should be there instead of you. So we don't really know because it hasn't really started yet. But that is what we're talking about here in Norway. So go to you.
There was even a round of like church shopping. So like at the English language Catholic Church here, some people started listening to preachers in England or in Ireland. And the priest here, an Irish priest, told me he was getting people from America, from Asia, from South Africa. And there was apparently this sort of shopping around. Oh, maybe it's nicer over there, nicer church, or you like the preacher. And then they wonder, these people come back to us, or will they just go to the YouTube all the time now?
That's the advantage of the English speaking. So let's go to Maria Paz. How has it been in Germany for the churches and the other communities?
You mean for the coverage as the religion report? Sorry, I didn't.
Yes. How has it been for you to cover them during the pandemic? We're going to wrap up soon, but we need
just. In fact, here we have had a very mild lockdown, even when it was a lockdown. So, and it was in spring and then summer, so you could really do interviews on the open air. If you keep the distance 1.5 meters, it's okay. So it was mostly about, you know, starting getting dates and time and do the interviews. The bad thing, as Tom mentioned, is that there were less celebrations, less Veranstaltungen, less things to go and where you can go around and just find stories spontaneously. That disappeared. You just cannot go to places so easily. So that has been a hindrance. But the really big challenge has been to cope with all these press conferences via Zoom, which is finally even tiring if you go through them. But there weren't many. Just wanted to mention very quickly something related to Spain that I forgot to mention before. There has been in Spain, to my knowledge, the only one national memorial for the victims of COVID-19, which was lay totally, not religious, and presided by the king and the queen and all the government. And that was really a moving thing, where a nurse explained about the health workers on the front line and relatives of the people who died. And then there was also a funeral in the Cathedral of Madrid, organized by the Catholic bishops. But this, I think it was quite of a milestone to have this lay funeral celebration in the town. And as I said, to my knowledge, I haven't seen anything similar in other parts of Europe, where they have even had more deaths than Spain. Like, for instance, in the UK, where they had like a lot of death, and or in France even. So that was an interesting development that I had forgotten to mention. So
thank you. Okay, thank you. We've been talking together for more than half an hour. It's been so interesting to listen to all of you, to talking to all of you. Thank you very much to Maria Paz in Berlin, Tom in Paris, and Elena in Serbia, Montenegro. And thank you very much to Andy Bayani sitting in Indonesia recording this. And thank you to everyone watching. Thank you for joining us on our website. You will also find the other panel discussions, and there will be more to come. Thank you very much.